Hello and welcome to this August edition of Third Thursday at Hoover's. Thank you for joining us. As mentioned in the reminder emails, our speakers would like you to join them in a toast to the Escadrille pilots. So if you need to prepare a beverage, now's the time to get that ready as I make a few announcements. I'm Brad Reiners, the Communications Director at the Hoover Presidential Foundation. I'm pleased to announce that the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum has reopened on July 6th and is expanding their hours of operations. You may now tour the museum exhibits Monday through Saturday from 10 to 3 p.m. You'll need to go online and purchase your tickets in advance as they're limiting the amount of people per hour as part of their COVID social distancing policy. The Hoover Presidential Foundation members are still admitted free of charge, but you still need to get those online tickets and check the box that you're a foundation member. Now, the other big news is we are proceeding with a capital campaign called Timeless Values, Modern Experience, where with your help, we'll raise $20 million to renovate the museum's permanent exhibit space and complete other upgrades. It's been 28 years since our last update, and it's time to refresh the exhibits. You can learn more about that on our website, hooverpresidentialfoundation.org. Now, with that, I'd like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook pages, as well as those of the library, the National Historic Site, and your favorite public library for special program offerings that will pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month for you to enjoy. So next month, we've added a bonus program on September 8th to mark the birthday of Herbert Hoover's father, Jesse Hoover. Jesse was an inventive and talented young entrepreneur, a self-taught blacksmith, an inventor, a pump manufacturer, community leader, and a pioneer West Branch businessman. When he's mentioned in biographies of his son, Jesse's little more than a footnote. So this program's all about him and is called The Life of Jesse Hoover, and it'll be presented by Peter Hanley, a park ranger at Herbert Hoover National Historic Site. Peter has a PhD in history from Iowa State University. Again, visit our website or your favorite public library to register for that free event. Now, for you Little House on the Prairie fans, our regular Third Thursday program on September 16th features librarian and researcher Laura Keyes, and she'll present Little Fashionista on the Prairie, as she describes the clothing of the period and their functionality. Tonight, however, we're excited to have the co-directors of a documentary film project titled The Lafayette Escadrille. I hope you've had a chance to view the preview link of the film that we sent you via email. If not, I'll include that link in the post-event email for you to see. Now, I'd like to encourage you all to enter questions for our speakers by using the Q&A feature on your screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during the program. So with us tonight is Darroch Greer, and he is a documentary filmmaker and historical researcher. He's written and produced documentaries on the Civil War, Native America, and popular culture for Disney, the History Channel, PBS, and VH1. Darroch is coming to us from the West Coast tonight. Joining Darroch from the East Coast is Paul Glenshaw, who is co-director and co-writer of the Lafayette Escadrille. He is a lecturer and instructor on art and history for the Smithsonian Associates and a regular contributor to the Smithsonian's Air and Space magazine. His career includes numerous projects for art and aviation museums across the country. So please welcome Darroch and Paul. It's great to have you both joining us from the East and West Coast tonight.
Thank you very much, Brad. I am particularly honored and happy to be here as I visited your lovely museum and library, I think back in 2016, where I presented my previous film on World War I aviation, The Millionaires Unit. And I really want to thank Tom Schwartz for inviting me then and for inviting me now. Tom is a dear friend, and we worked together for 4.5 years on the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And so, although I can't be with you in person, Paul and I are very happy to be with you virtually.
We're glad you could come in today.
Indeed. Well, I'll begin sharing the screen and we can begin our presentation. And Greetings from Washington, D.C., or just outside, rather.
We always begin our presentation in Paris, but at Harry's New York bar. And Harry's has been an institution since about 1913, and it's where the Lafayette Escadrille drank, and it's where they invented this very important cocktail, which I thought was called the French 75. Yes, there's Harry's address, 5 Rue Danube. And we went into the bar, and there's our intrepid cinematographer, Matthew Mazza, and we met Jerry, the bartender. And we said, Jerry, we'd like to film you making the French 75, made for the largest gun that the French had in World War I. And it's very simple. It's half champagne, half cognac. And he said, well, no, I can't make that. I said, it's very simple. It's half champagne, half cognac. And he said, no, that's not how you make it. And I said, well, it is right here on page 101 in Ted Parsons' I Flew with the Lafayette Escadrille. And I quote, William Thaw should have had at least one more medal. With Lufberry, he was the inventor and chief exponent of that very dynamic concoction known as, the Lafayette cocktail, not the French 75. It was composed of equal parts of brandy and champagne. This soothing mixture with the kick of a mule brought Thaw and many another good man down where the Boche failed. So without further ado, I would encourage you, if you have a bottle of champagne, to open it. There we are. And pour the cognac in first. And I would caution you not to make it with half champagne and half cognac, as that is a rather potent drink. So I pour about a shot of cognac in and then mix it with champagne. Because indeed, it is a very potent concoction. So I would like to raise a toast to the memory of the Lafayette Escadrille and to the success of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum's fundraising program. Santé. Oh, yes. This is the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial outside of Paris. It is midway between Paris and Versailles. And it underwent an 8-year renovation just in time for April 2016, which was the centennial of the formation of the Lafayette Escadrille. Our production team got a very generous grant, and we were able to get there just in time to film this. This is the day before the event, when family members of the Escadrille pilots started showing up. And it was a huge, beautiful ceremony with planes flying over and French and American dignitaries and the military attending, as well as the families. And here they are after the ceremony, all gathered. Relatives from France and America, most of whom had never met before, from the families of Norman Prince, Victor Chapman, Raoul Lufberry, both his French and American family. It was a thrilling day. And these are some of the Americans' family members whom we interviewed. In the upper left-hand corner is Guillaume de Ramel. He is the great-grandnephew of Norman Prince. He is a pilot. He's being interviewed in front of a plane that he built himself. And we'll be talking more about him and his family a little later on. To his right is Caroline Bridgman Reese, and she is the daughter of Ray Bridgman, who flew for the Escadrille. He actually was a pacifist and came over to France to drive ambulances, but he realized once he got there that he really needed to fight for France. And in spite of hanging on to his pacifist sympathies, he shot down 4 German planes and wound up being the commander of a squadron once the United States came into the war. Right below him is Nick Rutgers. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time in the Oregon National Guard. He was also the squadron commander, and he is the great grandson of James Norman Hall. James Norman Hall, whom you might know as the co-author of the Mutiny on the Bounty trilogy, as well as the Hurricane and many other novels. Nick is a 4th generation combat fighter pilot. James Norman Hall, World War I. His grandfather fought in World War II. His father fought, I believe, in both Korea and Vietnam. And Nick has just retired. He now flies for UPS. So think of him when his packages arrive on your doorstep in time. And in the lower left is Alexandra Truitt. And she is the grandniece of James McConnell, who also was killed in action during the war and had some very interesting things to say about the legacy of her great uncle and what it meant for her family. She's really a lovely person. Her husband is a researcher, and they helped us with some archives in Washington, D.C. So then the next year, 2017, Paul and I went to France. And here we are again with our cinematographer, Mathieu, on the Chemin des Dames, that ancient road northeast of Paris. And below there, down in the valley, were two towns, one of which no longer exists since the war, in which Kiffin Rockwell, one of our pilots, fought a very devastating skirmish during World War I that really, while he was in the French Foreign Legion, which really turned him around and how he felt about what his mission was in the war. And here are some of the people that we met in France. In the upper left-hand corner, Paul is there, and standing above him, facing us, is General Daniel Bastien. He is a four-star retired Air Force general, former reconnaissance pilot, and he was very instrumental in figuring out where certain things happened with the history of the Lafayette Escadrille just by using photographs, and we'll meet him a little later. To the right of him, I am interviewing Andre and Michel Spetz in Rodoren, France, in the Vosges Mountains, and they are also amateur historians. They don't speak any English. They have written a book on Kiffin Rockwell for children, and they are standing about 100 yards from the site where Kiffin crashed in his plane and died back in 1916. Right below them is another amateur historian, Jean-Marc Simon. He is in the town of Ham, H-A-M, where the escadrille had a rather difficult time. They had a number of crashes, and 4 of their pilots lost their lives in this time that they were in Ham. And Jean-Marc is standing right in front of a wheat field to make the great French bread, but also that is where the aerodrome and the airstrip was. The Germans had used it, they evacuated, and the Lafayette Escadrille took it over. Interestingly enough, the day we met Jean-Marc, he had a film crew with him. Paul and I were interviewed on a local French television channel, and several hours later, that afternoon at 5 o'clock, I think we were in a cafe, we saw ourselves on television with our interviews dubbed into French. And then in the lower left-hand corner is Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Patrice Lassant, and he is the commander of the Luxeuil-les-Bains Air Base, which is the first air base that the Lafayette Escadrille served at, where they were first based, where they learned to fly as a squadron. It had just been built, I think, the year before the war started. And Jean-Patrice thoroughly knew the history. He also spent 8 years in DC with the French Air Force, as I can't remember what his position was, but he had us over for dinner, and I got to listen to him and Paul talk about where the best bagels are in Bethesda, Maryland. And here is Paul interviewing General Evol Gout. Evol is a 2-star brigadier general, Air Force pilot, retired. He is also the past president of the Lafayette Association. And that is an association of veterans who fly for the French squadron that is still named for the Lafayette Escadrille. They're known as the Escadrille Lafayette. And Yvon Gout showed us where to buy Lafayette Escadrille baseball hats, which was very helpful. However, he also gave us carte blanche to the air base in which we are interviewing him. This is the day before the air show at Saint-Dizier Air Base. And jets were flying overhead in preparation for the festivities the next day. So it was a rather difficult job interviewing Evol, but we will meet him later at the end of our talk. And Paul, why don't you take it here?
Thank you.
I need to sip my Lafayette cocktail.
There you go. Thank you, Darroch. I will talk a little bit about the locations and the number of different places that we went to in France to shoot the film. It was very important to us that we introduce, especially to our American audiences, France as a character. The whole story happens in France, or 99% of it. Certainly the guys come from the United States, come from all over the United States, and certainly one of them comes from Iowa, who we'll be speaking about shortly. But the story happens in France. World War I, the Western Front crossed northern France. And so we felt it was very important to have that sense of place for our American audiences. This is the Musée Franco-Américain at Blérancourt, a very beautiful former chateau. You can see there the empty moat. And we went there to film some Lafayette Escadrille artifacts. One of the things that we did a lot of, and we'll have a good example for you in a second, is, and you see Darroch and Mathieu here in a little plaza in Luxeuil-les-Bains, matching up a period photograph to a present day location where the location is identical to how it was back in the First World War and immediately after. So we really wanted to be able to move in time from the present to the past very, very fluidly. This is Mathieu in front of the grand villa where the Lafayette Escadrille was housed when they first formed as a squadron and they first served as a squadron in Luxeuil-les-Bains. A very beautiful, formerly beautiful building, we should say. It's in a terrible state at the moment. And
a very delicate situation.
Very delicate situation, because we were told that if we showed up to film unannounced, we would meet the same fate as a BBC film crew that had showed up earlier, who had been escorted off the property by the owner, an elderly lady, and her trusty shotgun. We decided to take a different approach. And Darroch had the idea, let's get some flowers. Darroch's French, not so great at the time. Mine, not so great at the time. Mathieu is French. He is very charming. We showed up with flowers and a charming Frenchman, and we were given access. We're not inside, sadly. Apparently it's in terrible shape inside, but we were allowed to film this place. And it was important to us because, again, you know, if you read the Lafayette Escadrille story, if you read the letters and the diaries and so on, oh, we were put up in this wonderful villa. Well, what did it look like? Well, here it is. Its glory has faded, but at least we get a sense of the actual building.
Indeed.
Darroch mentioned General Bastien. There he is, second from the right, between Darroch and myself. And we are standing in the parking lot of the Presidente brand cheese factory in Corsieux, France. And it was General Bastien who, looking at photographs of the crash site of Norman Prince and that yellow house behind us and electrical grid maps of the time and topography maps of the time and street maps of the time, worked out that that's the spot where Norman Prince's aircraft hit the ground after he flew through some electrical power lines. And so we went to great detail to figure these things out and to have the enormous help of somebody like General Bastien.
And so the next time that you buy your Presidente Brie cheese in the grocery store, think of Norman Prince.
There, yeah, it's available all over the United States. This is actually an abridged version of our production map. All the little dots on Google Earth showing you where we shot portions of the film. And as you can see, it pretty much stretches from one side of northern France to the other, with a cluster around Paris. And Google Earth was really an important tool to us as we prepared to go over, because there were so many places to film. And we wanted to be as specific as we possibly could to bring our audience to the place where the story actually happened. So an example of that is right here at the little village of Bayonne, which sits on a ridge over the small city of Bar-le-Duc in northeastern France. And this is where the Lafayette Escadrille was stationed when they were flying to and fighting over the incredible Battle of Verdun in 1916. And we're very grateful to the German reconnaissance pilots of the time who were taking photographs of the French airfields so that they could bomb them, because we could marry up the reconnaissance photograph to Google Earth. So if you look carefully, I'll move my cursor here. If you look carefully, see this little hairpin turn in the road, and where the road splits here, this fork in the road, and this road over here. And we go back to Google Earth, and we go back to the reconnaissance photograph, we see that those roads are still there. They line up perfectly. And so by getting the scale of the photograph and the scale of the satellite photograph to match, we were able to see that here is the airfield. Here's the hangars and other associated buildings. There's actually little farmhouse buildings across the street that are still there. And so by being able to go back and forth, we could point our drone right here. There's a housing development in the way of what a portion of the airfield, but right here, that's still field. So that's where we put our drone. And so when we talk about the Escadrille leaving the airfield to go fly over Verdun, we're flying, you're flying, we're all going together out of this actual airfield where that happened.
And so, though this is a rather nondescript field, for us, it was really important to experience what they did, and it just gave us the confidence in our storytelling abilities that we were being as accurate as possible.
Absolutely. So this is another shot. This is the villa that they lived in when they were at Bayonne, Bar-le-Duc, the same airfield. A once lovely house, again, also in pretty bad shape. The owner would not let us inside, sort of a theme, but let us film outside. So we were at least able to see the sort of quarters that they had when the squadron began. And it gives us a nice contrast to later on when they're in terrible, rough tents and at one point underground in little mud shelters and difficult circumstances. And right around the corner from that is this alleyway. And it was right here, and General Bastien found this location for us too. And here we are in 2017, and here we are in 1916. Same place. If you look, even the downspout of the building on the left is still pretty much there. It's changed a little bit, but those are the same buildings. And on the left, you see Norman Prince, one of the co-founders of the Escadrille. On the extreme right, you see Didier Masson, one of the pilots of the Escadrille. And in the center, with all the medals and the cigarette and the cane, is Charles Nungesser, who was one of the most decorated and flamboyant and famous French fighter pilots of the First World War. And as they sort of said, there was not a lot of the original Nungesser left. He had been in so many crashes and had body parts replaced. He had a replacement for his jaw. He had a lot of gold teeth. And during one of his many convalescences, he went to Bayonne to fly with the Lafayette Escadrille in combat over Verdun. That's how he was convalescing. So for a brief moment, one of the most celebrated pilots in France in the First World War was a compatriot of the Lafayette Escadrille.
And he shot down a plane with them.
Yes, he did. This photograph represents a really great example of what we found in many instances across France. This is in the little village of Roederan, which is on the eastern side of France, right near the border of Germany. And this is where, right near where Kiffen Rockwell was shot down. And we are in the park, Kiffen Rockwell. It's a small little municipal park. And this stone marker has a quote by Kiffen: "The cause of France is the cause of humanity," a famous thing that he said. And it's right near where he died. And every year there's a ceremony commemorating Kiffen and the American volunteers who served France. And we went and filmed. And I can promise you, this was not put on for the camera. This was not put on for us as the film crew. This is what they were doing anyway. Where you see Colonel de Saint there in his dress uniform, just to the right center of the picture, saluting. And it was a beautiful ceremony that honored French veterans. It honored the memory of the Americans who served. And the young people in the background who you see wearing the blue polo shirts and blue jeans, that's an American high school band from Michigan. And in pre-COVID times, they did an annual tour of Europe. And one of the places they would go was Roederan. So there was an American youth orchestra playing our national, the Star Spangled Banner and the Marseillaise. And and then speeches they gave were all about the kinship between the United States and France. There you see our flag and their flag right in the center. This is, shows both the glamour of documentary filmmaking. That's me, my arm there, keeping the all-important camera clean and dry while Mathieu films the sort of overwhelming cemetery in front of the ossuary at Verdun. It was in 2016 that Darroch and I and our co-producer Dan Patterson first went to Verdun. I'd never been there. I'd read a lot about World War I. I had what I thought was a sense of the war, but it was really going to Verdun where you see the extraordinary destruction that took place and how the landscape around this battlefield, an area that's not very large, but that was completely obliterated in the course of a year-long battle, where entire villages were just completely wiped away, where you walk through this landscape, you drive through this landscape, and you still see what looks like a lunar landscape. It's full of craters, and the trees and the greenery has come up, but it's like the moon with trees. It's rather extraordinary. So trenches all over the places. And if you see a big sign that says Zone Rouge, do not walk on that ground. There's still so much unexploded material from the First War underneath in that area that it's dangerous to your life.
It's a remarkable way to see France. It may be the least traveled by tourists, but it really gives you a sense of the French character and French history. And they're very happy to see Americans there.
Absolutely. So it's a very sobering place, but very, very well worth a visit. And so we wanted to bring our audience there, of course. Here's another example of commemoration that we just found on the side of the road. On the left-hand side of the picture, you see the original gravesite of Jim McConnell, who Darroch mentioned earlier, one of the original members of the Escadrille. And he was shot down in the spring of 1917, and he was buried exactly where he fell. And you see on the left-hand side there, the picture, his original grave with the flags and the flowers, and even his bashed machine gun from his aircraft is there. Well, this marker, and I'll play this little piece of video again, this marker is at that exact spot. McConnell's body was moved to the memorial outside Paris, but his grave marker is still maintained and cared for every day. And it's just by the side of a little country road. We told no one we were coming, and there it was, beautifully kept up. And so
his name is misspelled, but it's really the thought that counts.
Yeah, they got the name wrong on the plaque, but sometimes things get lost in translation. You get a pass on the plaque if you're maintaining the site, and they certainly are doing that.
True.
So the families, and Darroch earlier when he was talking about the interviews we did, we talked to a lot of family members as we showed, and one of them being Nick Rutgers, the great-grandson of James Norman Hall. And since James Norman Hall is from Colfax, Iowa, and our audience tonight is in Iowa, we thought we would bring one of the most colorful members of the Lafayette Escadrille, whose origins are in Iowa, just spotlight his story just a little bit. He was from Colfax, from a family of very modest means, and we've been working with the archivists at Grinnell, where he went to school, to cultivate images. We're doing a supplemental film about James Norman Hall for our DVD because he's such an interesting character. And he always craved two things, even as a child. He craved solitude so he could write poetry, and he craved reckless adventure. One of the stories about him as a child that he wrote about in his autobiography is that, and he was probably about 9-10 years old when he did this, he and his friends would sneak out of their windows at night in the summertime and go to the spot in Colfax where the steam locomotives were taking on extra water. And while that was happening, they would sneak on to the pilot, what the rest of us non-trained people called the cow catcher, and they would sit on that. And then the train would take off in the middle of the night with them sitting on it, and they would ride the 30 miles to Grinnell and jump off and then go running around Grinnell in the middle of the night running around the campus. And this is eventually where he went to college. And then they would get on another train and jump in one of the cars and get back before the sun came up and their parents found out. So that's kind of at the core of James Norman Hall's life. And he did continue his entire life, even though he became, a machine gunner in the Royal Fusiliers. He still carried pocket editions of Romantic poetry with him all the way up to the front. And here we see him on the left in Wales on his tour of the sites of English Romantic poets and great novelists in 1916 in 1914 when the war was about to start. And there we see him in Colfax the year before he died on his last visit to the United States. He lived his life after the war outside of the United States. We'll explain that in a minute.
He was in Europe when World War I broke out. He sailed over there with his bicycle and went to Joseph Conrad's house because he wanted to meet him, but was too afraid to knock on the door, turned around and left. He claimed that he was Canadian so that he could fight with the British, which he did, but he got word that his father was dying, and so he told them he was really an American, and he went home. And while he was home, he wrote a book called Kitchener's Mob about his experiences with World War I. The press was not allowed to travel with soldiers and with what was going on. And Americans were very hungry to know what was happening. And so his book was published right away. And the Atlantic Monthly hired him to go write a story about these exciting Americans who were flying for France, the Lafayette Escadrille. And so James Norman Hall headed back to Europe. He met William Thaw and I believe Kiffin Rockwell in Paris and interviewed them, and they convinced him to join the Lafayette Escadrille. And so he did. Next slide, Paul. He trained as a pilot and he started flying. I don't know if yes, he did fly Newports, but he's standing in front of a SPAD here with the Lafayette Escadrille Indian Head logo, which came about, I think, in early 1917. And he didn't fly very long. He really stands out in the Escadrille because he was shot down twice. The first time he blacked out, miraculously landed over a trench that knocked off both his wings, and he went to the hospital and started writing articles. He came back in time to fly a Newport 28, and this is just before the war ended. And they hadn't figured out several things about the Newport 28, one of which was that the skin over the upper wing tended to rip and fragment. And this happened to James Norman Hall, and you can see it in the left-hand part of the picture there. The upper wing there, it shredded, and the plane became very unstable. And he was in the middle of a dogfight, and he started heading for home when an anti-aircraft shell hit his plane, lodged in the engine, and did not go off. As Mike O'Neill says in our film, it just stopped the plane. And he went down in a spiral and was able to level out and crashed and broke his ankle and broke his nose and was immediately captured by the Germans. And there he is with a tentative bandage over his nose. A lot of people don't know that in World War I, when you were shot down by the Germans, you were given a puppy. Many people don't know that.
James Norman Hall, after the war, he and another American fighter pilot were commissioned to write the history of the Americans who volunteered for the French, called the Lafayette Flying Corps. And they completed this work. I believe Derek's getting out his copy of it to show you. This 2-volume comprehensive history of the Lafayette Flying Corps, these Americans who volunteered. And they discovered, these two guys were strangers to one another, but they discovered that they were actually quite good writing partners and that they both had a passion for travel, and their target independently they had come up with over their lives. Their target was the South Seas and Tahiti and Polynesia. And so they went there after the war, and that's where these pictures were taken. Cut a long story short, they became writing partners. They started writing travel and adventure stories, and they hit their first really huge success with the Mutiny on the Bounty trilogy. And of course, the book has been made into 2 major motion pictures, and several of their other books were made into motion pictures. And so James Norman Hall, who craved both adventure and solitude as a boy in Iowa, and certainly found the adventure in the war, found the solitude in Tahiti. And I was fortunate enough to go there, thanks to his family, to interview his daughter in Tahiti. And so on the left, you're seeing his house, which has been reconstructed. With all what you're seeing there is his library, his typewriter, his studying chair. I even went through his phonograph records and interview his daughter, who she's no longer with us, but at the time she divided her time between the United States and Tahiti. And to go so far away to really recover from the war, which he did. And you see there on the right is his grave, and his epitaph is the first a few lines of a poem that he wrote in his family's woodshed in Colfax when he was 11 years old. We worked very closely with the families across a number of different fronts, including original material that they either had in their possession for a long time or had come recently in their possession. And the Freddie Prince collection is a perfect example. Frederick Prince Jr. was the brother of Norman Prince. Norman Prince was one of the co-founders of the Lafayette Escadrille. Norman and William Thaw founded the Escadrille, and Freddie was his older brother. And Freddie joined Norman in early 1916, going to France to train to become a fighter pilot. And his collection of material from the First World War had gone missing in the family. And an intrepid and eagle-eyed museum director in Rhode Island happened to notice that a Frederick Prince Lafayette Escadrille posting was on French eBay. And he alerted the Prince family about it, and come to find out that there in a junk shop in France was a rather unscrupulous dealer trying to make up some money off of this American's World War I collection. It turned out that Freddie Prince's steamer trunk full of stuff from World War I had been found. And the family acquired it. It came back to Newport, and I spent several days photographing the entire thing. It was extraordinary. We found photographs, you see there on the left, negatives, newspaper clippings, letters, maps, and perhaps most importantly, his diary. His handwritten, never before read diary of the First World War, of being a pilot in training, and the relationship that he had with his brother. On the left, you see Freddie, the older brother. On the left, on the far right, you see Norman Prince, and in the center, their father, very controlling man who had the controlling interest in the Chicago stockyards, extraordinarily wealthy family. And Norman was a very agitated guy. He was very high energy. He learned to fly against his father's wishes under an assumed name. And, you know, his family thought he was kind of crazy to go over to France and throw away his fortune and all his opportunities to go serve France as a fighter pilot. And then Norman brought his older brother over, who also became trained as a fighter pilot. And then when Norman was injured, and turned out to be mortally so, his brother on the right, you see his diary entry there for October the 14th and crossing over to the 15th and then 16th. That's the story of Freddie Prince racing across France by train from where he was training as a fighter pilot to get to where Norman was in the hospital.
Look at the writing at the very top of the right-hand page there.
It says, Nim died bravely at 2 a.m. at the Hôpital du Lac at Jardimer. And it's just heartbreaking. And the thing is, what we learn, this is an example of an operating principle of what Darroch and I did in this film, which is we're really blessed with the number of original materials that both we found and that were already published. Many during the war, their diaries, their letters, their accounts of what happened, and their voices are what really propels our film, because they tell it much better than we possibly could, because they were there, they did it. On the left, you see a fragment of a letter from the Prince brothers' mother to Norman. Dear Nimmy, I feel deeply for you and all your escadrille, poor Victor Chapman. So this is a note on the death of the first death that occurred within the escadrille. So there's a lot of tension between the parents and the kids, and it really comes out in this. And so we try to stand out of the way and let them tell the story as they tell it best.
Indeed.
Darroch, why don't you take this one?
These are the contents of Kiffin Rockwell's pockets when he was shot down and died in October of 1916. And these were found in a box. We were alerted by the Rockwell family that they thought they had some things in storage, and it was a box about yay big that said Newport on it, the name of the planes that they flew for the French. And this is it. Kiffin Rockwell's engraved cigarette case. You can see the engraving right under the yellow band there. The watch he was wearing, his handkerchief, which was stained with blood, and a fragment of the propeller with French mud on it. And he was carrying a photograph of his best friend, Victor Chapman. And this is a photograph of Chapman 3 days before he died. He had been grazed by a bullet in his scalp, and he was bandaged and still flying. Even that day that he was injured, he flew. And, to see these things, to see hand-rolled cigarettes that Kiffin Rockwell rolled, just extraordinary. And this is one of four or five collections that came to light that really had not been seen before by any of the authors of books or people that had looked into the story. It was quite moving.
Yeah, and the cumulative effect of all of this, and in talking to and interviewing two surviving daughters, both of whom have now passed, but the daughters of Lafayette Escadrille pilots is, we said to one of them, I could get anybody to talk about your father. There's certainly plenty of historians who know about him, but you're the only one who can say, my father. You're the only one who can say, daddy. And so there's an intimacy that comes from that, and a connection, whether you're a World War I history, buff, or you're an aviation history person or whatever. There's a lot of other people who don't know these stories, don't appreciate the significance of World War I. And when you can relate it in a very personal way, we all know what it means to have a parent. We all know what, it means that you can call somebody daddy. That's a way to connect folks who might, not already be engaged in this period of history.
Airplanes. My previous film, for those of you that saw it in 2016, The Millionaires Unit, it was about this group of Yale guys who finally got over in the last year of the war, and they flew for about 6 months. And I was lucky enough to go to New Zealand and film with Peter Jackson's collection of World War I planes. And it was one-stop shopping. They had all the planes we needed to tell the story, and we got up in the sky with helicopters, and it was really quite fun. However, this was completely different. One-stop shopping magnified by 4. These guys were flying as early as 1915. And we really had to see the development of the French and the German planes throughout the war to get the story. And there was no one place in which we could go to do that. So here we are in the skies over Pennsylvania. Our intrepid photographer, Mathieu Mazza, is in a contraption called a breezy. I don't know why they call it that, but he could film pretty much 180 degrees, and he is filming a replica Newport 17, which was the second iteration of the Newport that they flew. And one of the pilots, I think that is Tom Martin, two barnstormers had these planes, and they're 7/8 scale. They're just a little bit smaller, so they can take off the wing and stick it in the wings and stick it in a trailer, and they can barnstorm all over the Midwest. The only problem was they were painted inexplicably in Belgian colors, red, yellow, and black. So our co-producer, Dan Patterson, who's an artist, showed up early, and he repainted the rondelles and the fuselage of the planes with a secret ingredient. The ingredient he used was poster paint mixed with dishwashing liquid. And apparently you're supposed to be able to wash it off with a garden hose. And indeed, it did work out. And you can see in the next slide, the planes before and after. Well, the Belgian symbol of this particular pilot was a shooting star. And then Dan painted the Seminole Indian warrior head, which was the first insignia that the Lafayette Escadrille used on their planes. And here's the before and after. Belgian above in Dayton, Ohio, and French below in the middle of Pennsylvania, a tiny little place near Newdale. But we also filmed planes in France. In the upper right-hand corner is a Newport 28 flown by Thierry Roussel. And I mentioned that Paul and I had been to this air show at Saint-Dizier, and there Paul is in the lower right-hand corner. And we met Thierry and another pilot. They were flying World War I replica airplanes. And he said, the next day, I'm going to be out over Verdun. And when we were at Saint-Dizier, you can see that the sky was very gray and it was actually raining. But the next day at Verdun, it was spectacularly beautiful. Huge cumulus clouds. And we got some gorgeous shots with Mathieu shooting from the plane in the upper left-hand corner. This is a guy that I met on eBay, Eric Kircher. And he flew us in his plane. We hadn't shot through a glass canopy before, rather difficult, but we were able to get a few shots of the Newport, which was really great. In the lower right-hand corner, Paul is speaking to a pilot of the Patrie de France. This is the expedition air show pilots and planes that are akin to the American Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds. And these guys are quite something in their red, white, and blue planes flying overhead. And Matthew and I took a lot of shots of them with trailing red, white, and blue airstream and trail behind them. And in the lower left-hand corner, we are back at Luxeuil-les-Bains at the hangar that we interviewed Jean Patrice in, and standing with one of the pilots in front of one of the Mirage jets. And that Mirage jet is commemoratively painted for Georges Guinemer. And he was the premier French ace until he disappeared. No one ever found him in the skies in 1917. But he always called his planes Old Charles, his Newports and his Spats. And so we got to film them as well. It was really something being on that airbase. We were given carte blanche to shoot almost wherever we wanted. And we were actually down on the tarmac shooting Mirage jets taking off right in front of us. It was really something. However, the 2.5 years, 3 years into American, when the Americans came over, the Lafayette Escadrille was subsumed into the American Air Corps in 1918. But early on, we were never able to find a Newport flying with a German Eindecker, the Fokker Eindecker. And you can see right in the middle of the picture, the yellow monowing plane and the gray monowing plane behind it. Those were the fairly early iterations of what Anthony Fokker designed for the Germans. They were not maneuverable and didn't fly very fast, but they were the first planes that had a synchronized machine gun that could shoot through the propeller arc. And so it was a very, a very deadly duel that they had with the Newports, who were much more maneuverable, but shot much fewer bullets, and they had to shoot over the upper wing of the plane with the Lewis gun. And we really needed to demonstrate these flights. You know, this is when Victor Chapman was shot down and killed, where Kiffin Rockwell got the first victory and when he was shot down and killed. So in the 11th hour, and Paul and I had an air date at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force to show the film, I panicked and called a friend and found the Long Island Skyhawks. And here they are after a day and a half of shooting with their planes. And these guys don't mess around. They don't fly anything smaller than quarter scale aircraft. You can see second in from the right, a German Albatross, all made of wood, 1/3 scale, 1/3 scale. And they don't fly them, you know, zipping around. They fly them as much as they can tell of how those planes flew in World War I. And so we were able to capture the shots we needed. And we had six different air battles we had to illustrate. And so it was a combination of aircraft on the ground, real aircraft in the air, model airplanes, and archival footage. But we had to make them all look like they were their own separate battles. And so we are going to show you an air battle, one of the 6 that we shot. And well, we dare you to tell us which ones are models and which ones aren't.
Everybody knows who in a squadron wants to get kills. And it's not everybody.
The 17th of June, we were patrolling on the right bank of the Meuse and were supposed to remain there. But Chapman saw that all the Boches were on the left bank and, like a tiger, dashed at a group of them.
Chapman has been a little too courageous and got me in one of these mess-ups because I couldn't stand back and see him get in it alone. He was attacking all the time without paying much attention.
He attacked 4 machines. Swooping down from behind, one of them, a Fokker, riddled Chapman's plane.
The result was that he attacked one German when a Fokker got full on Chapman's back, shot his machine to pieces, and wounded Chapman in the head.
A stability control had been severed by a bullet. Chapman held the broken rod in one hand, managed his machine with the other, and succeeded in landing on a nearby aviation field. His wound was dressed, his machine repaired, and he immediately took the air in pursuit of some more enemies. He would take no rest.
Everybody knows.
So that is a combination of most of the material we used. I'm sorry, video plays rather jerkily on Zoom, and that's before any of the footage was color corrected. But it looks pretty spectacular on the big screen. And so the day the big screen came, this is Veterans Day, Armistice Day of 2019 in Dayton, Ohio at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. And there are Paul and me with our co-producer, Dan Patterson, standing with Kiffin Rockwell, Norman Prince, Raoul Lufberry, Victor Chapman, and James McConnell. Here we are at the reception. Beforehand, I'm standing next to David Hanna, who's written a lovely book on the Americans who fought for the Foreign Legion in World War I, many of whom were Lafayette Escadrille pilots. And there is Evol Gout, the Brigadier General, and we flew him out from Paris to join us, standing next to Paul with Kiffin Rockwell. We saw Guillaume de Ramel, the great-grandson of Norman Prince, earlier on. That is his identical twin brother, Regis de Ramel, and he's standing next to Nick Rutgers, again, Lieutenant Colonel in his uniform. And on my right is Captain Georges Tenot, the grandson of Capitaine Georges Tenot, who was the French commander of the Lafayette Escadrille. 3rd-generation pilot. He flies for American Airlines. And to see it on the big screen, FedEx became our corporate sponsor with finishing funds and is helping us with distribution. But to see it on an IMAX screen in a packed house was very exciting. But we weren't done. We had rushed to get the film finished, and the special effects, which was pretty much the tracer bullets and Archie explosions, in the air were not up to snuff. And so when Paul and I found out that we got into the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, my hometown, we had a month in which to get this all together. Also, the score of period music, much of it French, which Paul almost did by himself, was not up to snuff. And so we re-edited, got in some new special effects, and finally saw the film on the big screen in the way it was meant to be seen.
And so that brings us up to where we are now. So the Santa Barbara Film Festival was January of last year. Here we are of August of 2021. And we've got exciting news to share. The film has been offered to PBS stations by American Public Television this summer towards a November 2021 release. We're looking at screenings on public television stations across the country for Veterans Day. And the film will actually be available to public television stations for several years after that. So
we just learned today that 115 stations have picked it up. However, that's not cut in stone. There's some maybes and there are also some no's that can be turned around. So if you all are interested, I don't know your stations in Iowa, but if you want to get in touch with them and let them know that you want to see it, please do so.
Certainly. And we're also working with a distribution company in Paris who will be handling the distribution of the film outside the United States, because we're very interested, especially in having our French audience see the film, even though the story is much better known in France than it is in the United States. We feel it's very important for them to see it as well. So we're really excited about that. We're finishing up our fundraising for making sure that there's a DVD and Blu-ray and for this international distribution. But we are right at the finish line right now, which is very exciting after such a long process. We're thrilled with how the film has come together and can't wait for you all to see it.
Paul mentioned a supplementary film. We're making 4, maybe 5 supplementary films for the DVD Blu-ray. One on James Norman Hall, one on the Americans in the French Foreign Legion during World War I, and also a making of behind the scenes film that we're doing.
Indeed. So we'll leave it there for right now. We thank you so much for your kind attention. If you'd like to learn more about it, we're actually in the process of redoing our website, which will have our new trailer on. So if we're under construction when you visit, give us another chance in a few days. But we thank you so much for your kind attention. We'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you so much.
It was our pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, fellas, for that presentation. And, Dakota asked a question about where can you get the movie, and the PBS is a great opportunity to see that. Will there be DVDs available for purchase from that website?
We hope by Christmas that they'll be available.
Super. I'll include that website in the emails that we send out afterwards. And Derek, you have a relationship with Tom Schwartz, who's the director of our Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. We've worked together on projects at the Lincoln Museum, where Tom was previously before coming here. And Tom has a couple of questions for you. I'm going to try and see if I can't open
I can see them, Brad, and I can answer them with Tom's question. Tom, I'm so glad you got to see our presentation. You mentioned the strong theme of commitment to values in our film here, as in the Millionaires Unit, and you asked me to describe the similarities and differences in the motivations of the two groups. Well, first of all, the Millionaires Unit was a class and a fraternity of Yale guys who all decided they should learn to fly in case the United States went into World War I. And they got their wealthy fathers to get them an airplane, and they trained to get ready. And they were immediately ready when the United States went to war. And they were the first over to Europe to fly for the United States before any of the other services. So they were very idealistic, both the groups were adventurous, but these wealthy guys, they could have done anything in the world, but the real new frontier, the American frontier, had closed. The frontier of flight was really the exciting thing, and they believed in France, and they believed in the war against totalitarianism, but they were really fighting for America. The guys from the Lafayette Escadrille were older. And many of them had been to France, or several of them had been to France beforehand. And they really believed that they owed a debt to France for the American Revolution. They really felt that 100 years earlier, France helped us become a democracy, and France was in peril, and they were going to help. And so whereas the Millionaires Unit is a group of guys that went over hoping to fly together and then were dispersed, the Lafayette Escadrille were guys from all over the United States who then formed a group in France and fought together. So that's a very different dynamic. Also, the Millionaires Unit was able to have a very inspired ending, because those guys really went on to public service and were still fairly healthy, and most of them survived. The members of the Lafayette Escadrille were by and large really beat down by 4 years of war. And except for a few of them, the rest of their lives, several of them were quite tragic. A few took their lives. They really had a rough time getting a new foothold in the war. But both the groups believed in freedom and democracy, and against repression and totalitarianism.
So, Tom, I invite you to open your mic if you're able to, from your location, if you'd like to say anything in person. And also anybody with questions, please use the Q&A feature that we can easily monitor for your questions.
Brad, I see that Tom asked about the dogfight scenes.
Yes.
And how do we find the vintage aircraft? It's a rather sad story. I had a friend in California who he became my friend through the Millionaires Unit, and he had the greatest collection of World War I replica planes in the world, all of them with original engines. And he thought we did a good job with the Millionaires Unit, and we were talking regularly in the pre-production as we went up, and unfortunately he passed away in his Newport 28. An accident, it crashed and he lost his life. However, a year later, I asked his widow for permission to film his planes on the ground, and she graciously let us do so. So in the film, you will see 3 of the Newports. You will see a Fokker Eindecker. We threw the props on several of the planes on the SPAD 13. And so, for instance, the yellow Eindecker, you see it on the ground, full scale, beautiful plane. You see it in the air, it's a model. And it really works together. They were both yellow. So it really paid out. So, over our production was 4 years. I would say over 3 years. Paul and I shot planes in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, California, France, and New York. In the end, I went up to the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome, and they have, I think, the only flying SPAD 7 in the world that they had just painted in Lafayette Escadrille colors, and we were able to film that. That was probably the last plane that I shot before we finished the film.
Mm-hmm. Jan is asking, why did the Iowans stay out of the country after the war?
Paul, why don't you answer that?
I can answer that. Certainly. James Norman Hall, the guy from Colfax, James Norman Hall, who went to Grinnell, he had a deep spiritual connection to his home in Iowa as he remembered it as a boy, really especially before the car became a thing, before paved roadways became a thing. And for all of his adventures around the world and becoming a pilot and everything he saw and did, he craved being able to return to that time. And he was really dismayed with what he found in the United States after the war. He and his writing partner came back. They finished their history of the Lafayette Flying Corps, first in New York and then Massachusetts. And he was just really shocked at what he saw with what the internal combustion engine was doing to the United States, particularly with roadways. And it was something that was very hard for him to reconcile. He could no longer be in the United States because of that. Really, it wasn't a political thing. It wasn't a personal thing against his family. He just needed a simple, quiet place like he knew Iowa in his childhood. So I would say almost primitive. And he had this lifelong longing to go to the South Pacific. That was where they first started their adventures. And when he went there, although it's wildly different place in terms of climate, in terms of scenery, these tiny little islands, he felt that connection to what he had known as a boy, a very simple place to live.
And Joseph Conrad.
Yes. And so he really, that is why he went there. His children, one was born in Tahiti, one was born in California. His children went to school in the United States. Certainly he did a lot of business with the United States with his publishers and then, selling the rights for his books to films and so on. And he did return to the United States to visit, but the kind of place that he needed to go to, and it was one of the reasons the family insisted we go interview his daughter in Tahiti, was to go as far as he did, to go as far away as he could. I think for his own personal health, for his mental health, that was something he needed to do. And as his daughter says in the film, talking about Tahiti, he died here a happy man. He was not plagued by some of the problems that the other Escadrille, some of the other Escadrille survivors suffered from. Certainly some of them had extraordinary careers after the war, became great architects and writers and lived very full lives, but some of them struggled terribly. And as Derek mentioned, a few of them took their own lives. And James Norman Hall wanted always to be a great writer, to be a great novelist. And he was able to do that in Tahiti. It worked for him. And so he never lost his love for the United States, but he personally needed to be in a place like that. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope that counts.
I'm just going to add, I don't think this is giving anything away, but the end of our film, James Norman Hall got out of his German prison camp, went to Paris and asked the commanding general there if he could borrow a Spad and fly over the Western Front by himself. And that's what he did. He flew over this empty destruction, just taking it all in, landed the plane, never flew again, never even got a driver's license.
Yeah. This was a guy whose idea of high-tech transportation was either a steamship or a bike.
Right.
Okay. So
we don't know what station yet, what PBS stations are going to show the film, but we can find that out and let you know. And also you can contact your local station and just let them know that you see it. I see Tom has a few other questions. I can quickly talk about the William Wellman film. The William Wellman film, the Lafayette Escadrille, made in the 50s, 53, I think, was taken away from him by Jack Warner and retitled the Lafayette Escadrille. That was not the title that William Wellman had for it. And it was the last film William Wellman ever made. And they almost got in a fist fight over it. Wellman said, if I ever see you off the studio, I'm going to beat you up. But yeah, he got a lot of flack from the Escadrille pilots, and I'm sure it was rather painful. Wellman was a World War I aviator. I think he shot down 2 planes, and so that was a tough thing for him. I have never seen the film, and people in World War I aviation circles tend to ignore it. Tom also asked about how the French remember the Lafayette Escadrille. And it's really quite something. We showed you those few slides, but there are many Lafayette Escadrille sites around France that have fresh flowers on them. So there's the memorial, underneath which is a crypt with 62 sarcophagi, I think, 51 of which have remains in them of all the American pilots that flew for French squadrons. The Lafayette Escadrille is the only all-American squadron, but other American pilots flew for French squadrons. But, you know, there of the Lafayette Escadrille, 38 members, there are probably 4 graves in other parts of France that we saw fresh flowers on a few of them, and, you know, manicured gardens around them. People would overhear Paul and I at restaurants and ask us what we were doing. And it was as if, you know, World War I had happened, you know, 2 years before. You know, they knew the story. They thanked us, you know, as if we had been veterans, you know, for just coming and documenting the story. So that was very moving.
Mm-hmm. What was the life expectancy of an Escadrille pilot?
That's a really good question. You know, many of the pilots, most of them were not shot down. Some were. Most of them did not shoot down any airplanes themselves. The Lafayette Escadrille, as in terms of its performance in the war as a squadron, is about average in terms of the number of victories that were counted. And we go into detail in the film about how difficult it was to get a victory counted. But, you know, for the majority of them survived the war. So their life expectancy was actually pretty good for your average. But you also have to understand something about the Lafayette Escadrille. Many of them were very seasoned veterans, either of the Ambulance Corps or of the French Foreign Legion when they joined the Lafayette Escadrille. They had already survived a lot. They had very strong survival instincts and skills. And they were also lucky. Let's just put it that way. But, you know, life expectancy for the average World War I aviator was very short. You know, I've seen it as 4 weeks. I've seen it at 6 weeks. The Lafayette Escadrille also moved around from places to places. Sometimes they were right in very hot sectors where there was a lot going on. Sometimes they were in quiet places. So they're an interesting case study in that respect.
Of the 38 members, 11 died. So a little more than a quarter of them, less than a third. But in the Millionaires Unit, I used a statistic that of all pilots flying, was it? I don't think it was Americans, but of all pilots, the life expectancy was 3 weeks for a pilot. The development of aviation was so fast through the war. You know, the war started 13 years after the Wright brothers flew. And so there were these new iterations of planes constantly and experimenting with different things. And more pilots died in training than in actual combat. And there's kind of a joke about the Sopwith Camel, which was maybe the most difficult plane to fly because of its rotary engine and its weight ratio, that more people died learning to fly the Sopwith Camel than were shot down by Germans. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but I've heard it said many times.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one last question, and it refers to a couple of years ago here at the park system. The National Historic Site brought in a traveling display about the Red Tail Squadron. So was racism a factor at all in the Lafayette Escadrille?
That's a really good question. We have photographs of the Lafayette Escadrille pilots, some of them in the French Foreign Legion before they all joined while they were still in the Foreign Legion, a group of American soldiers. And it's really pretty much half black, half white. There was not racial segregation in the French Foreign Legion, nor was there in the Service Aéronautique, the French Air Service. And indeed, one of the American veterans of the French Foreign Legion, Eugene Bullard, after he was wounded at Verdun and recuperating, he went into the Air Service and became the first African-American fighter pilot. And he served with a different squadron. He was part of the Flying Corps. He was not in the Lafayette Escadrille. However, when the French when the American volunteers flying for the French were assimilated into the American Army, there was no way that Bullard could become continue to be a fighter pilot, because he would have needed to be an officer, which black soldiers were not allowed to be. And that would have meant he would have been superior to other American servicemen. So it's complicated, but there were no black pilots in the Lafayette Escadrille, but segregation was not a thing in the French military at that time.
There was one influential American, Dr. Edmund Gros, who founded the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just west of Paris. And he had a particular prejudice against Eugene Bullard and tried to stop him from flying. But Eugene Bullard made a bet. He was already in Paris. And though he didn't have the money, he bet 2,000 francs that he would be able to become a pilot. And this was a bet between three people, one of whom was a wealthy friend of his who said he would pay his debt if he didn't make it. And he became a fighter pilot. Not only that, he owned a jazz club in Paris, and which was frequented by German officers in the lead up to World War II. He knew German and worked as a spy, overhearing them. And then when the war started, when Germany invaded France, he went back to his old unit as a machine gunner until what they called the phony war was over. And then he had to retreat, walking through France to get into Spain, to get to Portugal, and he finally left. It's an amazing story.
Yeah.
There are a lot of great stories that you shared with us tonight, and I thank you for doing that. I'm really looking forward to when we can see the public release of this coming up in November on PBS and however else, getting the DVDs out and things like that. But that is all the time we have for questions right now. I'd like to thank Darroch Greer and Paul Glenshaw for joining us tonight and for an excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum, the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and all the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. So I encourage you all to come and visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings, and also get your tickets online and tour the museum now that it's reopened with extended hours. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is still hard at work and ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. And don't forget to tune in next month for another couple of great Third Thursday programs. On behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus.